So look, let's start with some questions, and we've got a whole series of really good questions here. And I want to go back to Jono's talk, and these are questions from the audience. I'm just going to field them to you, Jono. So a couple of key issues. One is that, everything you talk about that relies on prediction or trying to forecast the future relies on high quality global data sharing, which requires protecting the security of data and data users. How can you guarantee that data won't be misused? And what's your vision for that? So that we can get better access to data quickly.
Yeah, this is indeed one of the key challenges, and something that we're working hard with our data folks about. And there are technical solutions in terms of how it's filtered. There's governance solutions, and part of that is really having data sharing overseen in a more transparent way, so people know the rules of the road, and building in protections. But it remains a challenge. I think one way that we need to frame this, though, is in pandemics you get rights conflicting. The right to privacy, when the right to privacy interferes with the right to health and life, you've got to make some trade-offs. I mean, and I think that's part of the challenge, is getting that right balance and realizing that actually the countries that have done best, like Singapore and South Korea, they've managed it for the most part to protect privacy, and therefore saves lives. That said, they've had some apps that weren't protected. So again, both the technological and the governance, and realizing that rights can conflict, and there's some judgments that need to be made.
Really good. Thanks very much. I'm going to go one question to each speaker, and then we'll have a couple of general questions then. We've got really some excellent questions from the audience. So for Kate and Danielle, and I find this personally very interesting because, of course, as you know, we've been working in China for many years, and it's not straightforward. You're dealing with trade issues at a time when trade issues became a very key global political issue. And yet you're relying on openness and access to a very sensitive problem, which is clear, that there's this impact on swine production in China that affects global trade health issues. So first of all, how did you deal with that to get access? What was the trick? What was the strategy? And how could that be scaled up to encourage a broader initiative like Global Health Data Network? For either Kate or Danielle.
Sure, I can take that one. So first, I just wanted to say that we're primarily working with USDA, who has the lead for the US government on this issue, as we mentioned in the talk. And as for China specifically, US and China have been engaged in a phase 1 US-China trade agreement over the past year that established some purchasing targets for US commodities, which I think include both soy and pork products. And FDA and USDA are engaged together on implementing the agreement that would open up exports of pet food, feed additives, premixes, compound feed, and distillers' grain to China. So that's just some suggestions and activities surrounding collaboration around trade to improve global health network. And I think regarding some of the data network, Danielle could probably take that one.
Yeah, as far as the animal health laboratories question, Kate, is that what you were referring to?
I think to get to that question.
Sure. Peter, do you want me to address that, or do you want to continue?
Yeah. Please.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the questions was, does the U.S. national and state animal laboratories have the resources needed to ramp up for ASF testing. And again, that would fall under USDA's jurisdiction, and they've worked with their network of laboratories on testing and testing capacity in the event of ASF would be detected in the United States. So they would really be the lead agency to talk about their current capacity status. But I did mention as part of my part in the presentation that their USDA's Red Book, which is their ASF response plan, they do outline sample collection and diagnostic testing, and they identify that the National Animal Health Laboratory Network provides standardization and response testing for any foreign animal diseases, and that currently, at least as of April 2020, that there are currently 46 laboratories approved to test for ASF.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay. Question for John and Wasi, and I really like these questions that are coming through because they get into the heart of some of the problems we have in dealing with these things, which are often around quite sensitive issues. And here's something, the thing that came up a couple of times. So John, if you imagine the IPBES panel that you were part of, if there was a One Health panel similar to that, how would you ensure on-the-ground experts from low and middle income countries are given the leadership role they deserve? Since, and it's true, I agree with this, most successful One Health projects, at least at a national scale, seem to be in low and middle income countries. How do we empower that and learn lessons from those people? John.
Thanks for that, Peter. Now, I think beyond just looking at it as perhaps a One Health, council or a One Health kind of panel, I recommend it's looked at more from a pandemic prevention kind of viewpoint. Then ultimately, the work of such a high-level council may lead countries to being able to set up mutually agreed goals or targets. And this would be within the framework of some kind of accord or agreement. So that would mean there would be a system whereby there is contribution and agreement on what the priorities are. I made mention of a couple of things. I spoke about being able to agree on who is at risk and how to go about addressing those risks. And I made mention of the challenges regarding variances in value systems, which sometimes make achieving consensus difficult. So I think just like in the IPBES process that we went through, Peter, where as an expert, it was actually my country representatives who had to approve or request for my participation in a way. And so more or less I was representing the country, if I put it that way, with whatever expertise I had to offer. And if we are able to do this in a similar way for kind of an intergovernmental council on pandemic preparedness, I think it would ensure that the voices from the global south are heard. And not only just because they're from the global south, but to particularly address this issue of variance in a value system. I was actually going through a series of questions, actually like a questionnaire for another Lancet Chatham House Commission, and we're looking at a bunch of things into the future, which would be priorities for reducing the impact for mitigating climate change. And one of the comments I had was I felt that some of the issues were not sensitive to, or the priorities that had been projected were not sensitive enough to different value systems. For me, I think this is where the challenge would lie. But there is always a silver lining. That's what we need to find.
Really good, John. And it's talks to one of the key strengths of the multilateral approaches that have been widely criticized for the past few years and continue to be. And, this ability to bring equity to the table is really important. Okay, question for Rajiv. So, the vision of building this broad vaccine platform toolkit, how will you deal? I mean, the essence of the question is very critical. You're on the board of CEPI, where you're representing a global approach there. yet you're working for a company that has a for-profit basis that is at risk if you open up your development strategy as you go forwards. So how are you going to be able to work in different companies to share data and frameworks in a collaborative way to get the rapid gear up and balance the sort of profitability with the equality of access in the ultimate product? How do you balance those two things, the collaboration and then the ultimate equity at the end of that?
It's a really important question, and I think CEPI is going to be in a good position to tackle this. I mean, the benefit of having CEPI is that it had a few years of practice under its belt. It wasn't practicing; it was actually working on Lassa, Nipah, MERS, chikungunya, Rift, as you know. Going forward, post-pandemic, with a new pandemic emphasis, you could envision a scenario where CEPI supports multiple companies, multiple platforms, and allocates out targets or potentially vaccine constructs for the different companies to put onto their platforms and funds them to do that. And I think that's an important concept that we need to understand. For a company, the idea of investing R&D and taking on the opportunity cost to develop something for a hypothetical threat is usually a non-starter. It's just not something that you can afford to do when you have to maintain your operation. You need to generate products that have impact and generate return for the company to be able to keep going with your innovation. And so the idea that governments can come in and support this kind of R&D through an entity like CEPI is a really new innovation in R&D. We've never had this opportunity before, where multiple countries can put in as much as they feel that they're able to support vaccine R&D. Usually, vaccine R&D is so complex that most governments aren't comfortable making those investments. So I think CEPI can play a key role here, and I think that there can be an allocation across companies. And I think companies would be happy to take constructs that come in from CEPI because they've gone through some scientific vetting, so they know they're not having to figure out what vaccine construct to use. They've actually been given something to then apply their platform to.
Brilliant. And and I'm going to now ask a couple of questions for the group, and we're going to carry on until 11:40 for everybody listening. So this is from an MPH student, and I'm always buoyed up and excited when you hear from people who are in the process of developing their careers and want to know, they're eager and ambitious to get out there and do this work, but want to know what skill sets are needed. So what skills will the next generation of public health professionals and epidemiologists need that today's cohort don't have in order to operationalize this forward-thinking strategy, the predictive approach, the global collaborative approach, the vaccine platform approach, the One Health on the ground approach? What skill sets are missing? And maybe if a couple of you can answer that, just speak up, and then we'll go on to another question for the group too.
This is Jono. Well, I think, first of all, I think that a wide variety of skill sets can have an impact. So it depends a little bit on your talent. But one of the skills, we've had a whole lot of chance to learn technically how to use Zoom. What we haven't done is figured out socially how to maximize the collaborative benefit of Zoom. And it's like a little kid on a phone. They pick it up, they can do it mechanically. They start talking before people are on the other end because they need to learn socially. And I think that's a critical skill set, which totally changes the possibilities in every area, but we got to learn how to use it.
Peter, I think what we found in this pandemic is that it takes people from a broad range of backgrounds in order to come up with an effective response. But going forward, I think clearly data science is going to be very, very important. Real world evidence is also going to be important. This notion that the primary place where we gather data is through tightly controlled clinical trials. We need to evolve to go, we'll always need that, but we'll need to go beyond that. And to the extent we have people that understand what data systems you can put in place in advance so that you don't have to do something special once an outbreak happens, that you actually have the ability to collect data on an outbreak, so you have that situational awareness with high fidelity data. I think that would be incredibly valuable. We've been talking about this for decades and we still don't have that That's it. That capability, and we need, you know, talent to come in and help us to build that.
Yeah, Peter, I can just wade into to that discussion as well. You know, from where I sit, I just want to go back to this issue about the value system, this understanding the way the world functions. I was fortunate, I got trained as a medic in Ghana, and then I studied in the US. But there's one thing that I always, I'm happy I had the opportunity to do, which was to do a minor in development studies and social change. Totally changed my perspective on how the world works and how to do science, to do research. So now my work would range across, you know, trying to understand snake bite in a rural part of Africa through to doing clinical trials for COVID right now and doing seroprevalence studies. And so my recommendation is for people to understand the complexity of the world. You cannot grasp it all, not possible. But when you understand the complexity, then you're able to know who you should bring on your team, who you should partner with. The knowledge of what you do not know helps you to know where to go or who to go to for the help. I think this is perhaps the one thing that as a student, whoever asks a question, you should focus on, trying to understand the degree of complexity and then know where to go.
Well, these are great career tips for everyone in the audience who's at that stage in their careers, because, you know, you've got to stand out above the competition, and having expertise in a unusual side issues that you think might not be critical end up being critical when people are developing these interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary teams. And I just think that it brings, that diversity brings real value, as well as to every other form of diversity in the future. It's going to be a different world as we move forwards. And, you know, Rajiv touched on one of the questions here, and I'll start off with maybe Kate or Danielle, and then others please chime in. This question is about how does government move forward with a predictive recommendation? So specifically, when a novel disease happens, there's an outbreak response to that. We globally require a willingness of governments to implement drastic response measures. And we saw that in China with COVID early on, but maybe it could have been earlier, you know, a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier when Wuhan went on lockdown. There is a natural tendency to underreact as the political fallout is significant for taking severe restrictive measures. And we've seen that in plenty over the past year. So how do we address this critical issue? So you're going to come up with a predictive framework. Danielle, Kate, you're working on geopolitical issues around trade. How do we get more proactive? How do we make or push or insist that governments and intergovernmental agencies act on that early? So we'll start with Kate or Danielle, and then others please chime in.
I would say, first of all, I mean, that's a heavy task, and, you know, something that we're dealing with right now. Having the open communication, having the ability to reach out to partners and other agencies to have those, you know, tough discussions is vital. Knowing who to contact, having, you know, a framework of individuals that you can reach out to will help start the process. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a collaborative approach, and each center, each agency has individual expertise in a certain area, and it's really just identifying what the need is and where, I guess, the projected disease, let's say disease outbreak, where that's taking us, where what entities are going to be impacted the most, and then also trickling down to state and local entities as well. I mean, especially for ASF, you know, you have swine producers, you have packing facilities, you have rendering entities. And so all of those individuals need to be aware of what's happening at the same time. That's why we had brought up the use of the tabletop exercises and implementing those, just to even get the word out and making people understand the complexity of the issue and how severe the issue is. And I left out local, state and local veterinarians as well, but you know, those individuals need to be as aware of what's happening too, as we move forward. I don't know, Kate, if you had any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have too much to add to what Danielle said. Um, I will say that I understand that sometimes there are sensitive nature to the initial response, as we've seen and from the coronavirus pandemic. And there's kind of a balance and a trade-off of knowing when to and just speaking from myself, knowing when to alert the industry or different stakeholders to what's going on versus, and does that cause more harm versus benefit in terms of an early notification and transparency. But for example, with ASF, one big question that I'm aware of is regarding testing. Is the virus what is the meaning of a positive test? And does that mean that there is live virus, or is it, just a fragment of dead virus? And does that mean that it has been introduced to a new region or not? And so that has been one specific, challenge with ASF in particular that I am aware of, is surrounding testing and laboratory, laboratory results with that virus.
Really good. Others?
Yeah, this is a critical area. This is what we call the damned if you do, damned if you don't. In the 70s, there was a swine flu. The CDC director rightly rang the alarm. The virus misbehaved and didn't go global, and the CDC director got fired. And we know the story of WHO perceived to overreact for H1N1 in 2009, and then they were reluctant. So three things. One is I think we need better decision tools. Looking back at what we spent a lot of time modeling what the virus does, we didn't do anywhere near the work we needed on modeling human behavior. So we had really, really blunt lockdowns. So better decision tools. Number two, really preparing the public over time and stakeholders, the business community. I think that's really key. And number three is annual rehearsals, so that you're not, the brain works differently in emergencies. So you really need to go through this. When we hand over cabinet responsibilities in the U.S. government, there is a conversation on pandemics that happens with them. They hand that over, but it gets lost in the fray. So I think it's a really critical issue, but there's some really concrete things that we can do to improve that.
Okay, that's really good. Let me just bring in one last question. We've got a little bit of time for Rajiv and John. Similar issue, but slightly different. And let me pull up the question. But what we're talking about here is the billions of dollars spent on COVID response of a disease that will cost trillions. But for decades, it's been really hard to mobilize even a fraction of that for disease X preparedness. And there's a misunderstanding of what that means. I've heard journalists say, well, COVID-19 was disease X, so we're done with that. So how do we shift the reactive psychology? This is a matter of saving billions of dollars and potentially millions of lives for the next big one, but we don't know when that will be. So how are we going to persuade governments, taxpayers to fund this work? So over to Rajiv and John for a tough question.
Well, a lot of pandemic preparedness is about imagination. And when you think about what happened with lockdowns, when I was involved in the US government on working on pandemic preparedness, we talked about community mitigation strategies like closing schools and so on. We got lots of pushback. What ended up happening in this pandemic went so much further than we ever envisioned, and people were able to do it. Now, lockdowns are not the solution to everything. The point is, though, that when you're faced with a threat, you do whatever is necessary to save lives. In this case, our imagination has been stretched. We have this collective trauma of seeing what a pandemic virus can do. There is a risk that people will think that this is as bad as it could get. But Peter, as you know, and others, this is not as bad as it could get. If you have a lethality that is higher than what we've seen with SARS-CoV-2, which we've seen with many other viruses, or more transmissibility, which we've seen with many other viruses, you could have a much worse pandemic. And so we do have this threat that is going to be on people's minds, at least for some period of time. This is the opportunity to get the resources we need to get an initiative off the ground. I would call it a moonshot, to quote unquote take the pandemic threat off the table, at least some of the threats. And the great thing also is that we have tools that we've now proven. So we can actually map out on a piece of paper what it would take to have a toolkit to be able to reduce the time to vaccine availability in substantial supplies. So we have a roadmap, if you will, to get this done. And we have at least one and emerging others that are ready to do the work. Beyond CEPI, Europe is the European Union is coming up with a BARDA-like entity, HERA. We know the African Union is very, very concerned about this issue. BARDA continues to be a player in this space. So I do hope that coming out of this, we'll see momentum to actually do something significant. This is the first time in history we have the tools in place to be able to meaningfully change the pandemic threat or mitigate it.
I totally agree. Over to you, John.
No, thanks, Peter and Rajiv. I think you really nailed it there. I'm just going to power some of what you said. From where I sit in Africa, I wonder what the situation would have been if not for Ebola, because Ebola was definitely more frightening a disease than COVID. And because of Ebola, there were certain systems and capacities put in place, which if had not been there, I really just don't know what things would have looked like. And even with that, we're still having a lot of challenges. It just shows you that we have the opportunity to do what I call, the Great Reset. The Great Reset. This is really the time to do it different. I'm afraid we may be missing the opportunity, but it's not too late. If you look at the systems that have been put in place, especially for being able to conduct research into drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics, and not just those three, but also clinical characterization of unknown diseases. It's really amazing. I lead the Operational Readiness and Resilience Work Package for ALERT, which is the African Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Response, actually research response, which is an EDCTP funded consortium involving European and African countries. And we have put in place measures which would allow us to begin research as quickly as possible whenever there's an epidemic or pandemic anywhere in Africa. We tried it with monkeypox, worked really well, worked with the plague in Madagascar, worked quite well. We're already active in Ebola. So it just tells you that these mechanisms can work. And it's because of some of these mechanisms that Africa was able to do some of the things that they did pretty early to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. So I would say, this is the time, but it's the money that needs to be put behind it. We've seen so much that has gone into some of the negative externalities of the pandemic, but not even half as much going into addressing the fundamental causes, which will continue to put us at risk of yet another disease X. The X never goes away. Never goes away. It's ever present.
Brilliant. Okay, look, I want to have a virtual round of applause for our speakers. Thank you for just a superb, stimulating session on this last day. We're now going to go into our breakout groups. I'm going to steal a phrase of John Mwasi, who I believe stole it from Apple, which is we need to think different. And yeah, it's grammatically incorrect, but that's fine, even for a Brit. So let's get into our sessions. Let's think different, and let's start to work out how we can mobilize and how we can mobilize our own communities and how we can take some of these ideas into reality. So please join your relevant breakout group, and I look forward to joining the ones in the predictive session now. Cheers.